Hello, everyone. My name is Mantay, and I'm going to be your host for today's episode. And we're going to dive into the concept of moral injury. So, along with me, I'm joined with Dr. Daniel Roberts, who is the president and CEO of MISNS. And MISNS is a moral injury support network for service women. And I'm actually so excited to be interning with MISNS as part of my applied practice experience because they are an organization that advocates not only for, yes, service women, but just women's mental health in general. So throughout this series, we are going to be hearing from service women who have experienced moral injury and how they've been dealing with that. I'm also joined by the lovely Jamie, Senior Exec Officer, who is also a retired military officer. So we're going to be listening and diving into Jamie's experience with moral injury as well. So we're going to go ahead and pass the mic to Dan.
Hey, good afternoon, evening, whatever, wherever you're at. Good to talk with you today. As she mentioned, I'm Dr. Daniel Roberts, President and CEO of Moral Injury Support Network. And we are an organization based in North Carolina, and we specialize in research, training, education, and direct support to service women affected by moral injury. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of that as we go along. But I'm very happy to be working with Jamie and Monte on this on these podcasts.
All right, Jamie, do you want to give us a little intro?
So my name is Jamie Peer, and I just came on earlier this summer of 2023 with MISNS. So I'm now serving as the Senior Executive Officer, and really just I'll share parts of my story here in a little bit, but I'm kind of one of those people that when I see something good going on that I want to support, I tend to try to figure out who's in charge of that thing. And so I reached out to Dan and figured out that he's a great guy with a great mission. And I felt very honored to be asked to join the team and help the cause. So just glad to be here and excited to work with you too, Monte.
Excited to work with you. So Dan, I'm going to ask you, what inspired you to create MISNS? And obviously, you're a male, and obviously, this is targeting women in specific. I just want to know, like, what caused you to start this nonprofit just simply targeting women? Because you could obviously just target it just men.
Right.
So what's your view on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I get answer that question a lot, actually. So one of the reasons, so let me first go what inspired me to create MISNS. I was conducting research on moral injury in women veterans. I was interviewing women veterans who had experienced moral injury. And as somebody who's worked in the Army chaplaincy for over 20 years, I was shocked that I had never heard some of the stories that I heard. Like, I did not realize that military women went through some of the experiences they went through. Everything's like, we've heard of sexual trauma, but do chaplains know that um, about forced abortions? Do they know about the extreme level of disrespect and bullying and um, you know other kinds of violence that women go through, both emotional violence and physical violence? And this is what the women we were interviewing, that I was interviewing, told me about, not from 1960 or 1950 or 1970, but in the 2000s, women experiencing these things. And as somebody who worked on the chaplain corps, I had no idea. And I realized, like, a lot of other chaplains need to find out about experiences women are actually having. And so my first idea was to create a conference that would bring together chaplains and women veterans that would share, they would be able to share some of this experience, and chaplains would be able to learn firsthand what people are going through, what service women go through. And to do that, I realized that the a nonprofit organization is best suited as the best business model for that. And of course, we ended up morphing to other things beyond just a conference. But it was really based on what I was hearing in those stories through my research. Now, what got me interested in focusing on women is prior to me even starting my doctorate program, I was sort of identifying that in the military, women were not only underrepresented but often under cared for, especially by the chaplain corps, by some of the chaplains I saw. Not the chaplain corps as an institution necessarily, but and so I just I feel like God placed it on my heart to care for these people, not just my own gender. So I began to really pay attention to how women were not always served as well as they should be, and that led me into my dissertation, which actually focused on chaplaincy support to wounded service women who had been wounded during an overseas deployment. And so and realizing there was a gap in research. There's always a gap in research when it comes to women's issues. So that gap was something that I had a heart to try to help with, and missions became the baby of that brainchild. So
That's really nice.
So, Mantay, before we get to the next question, I just, Dan, I wanted to tell you, like the part about things kind of blowing your mind, not realizing that this was a reality. I just want to let you know, even just this past week, talking to my husband, who, for all intents and purposes, was raised in a healthy family. He had a lot of
right,
support from his parents, played sports, developed a lot of those leadership traits and attributes as a young person, and then came in the military where those were just, further groomed and appreciated. He said, he's in the military and he works with cadets, male and female, and he's made it a point to tell the female cadets, look, if something doesn't feel right, say something. Don't suffer in silence. Because it was always like months later that he was hearing about things. And then when he would dig into
right,
the situation, he would find out that they just didn't say anything. And it just,
yeah,
it really hit home to me. Like, he hasn't had to suffer in silence. He's always been empowered. He's a six
right,
foot five white guy, right?
right,
He's always been empowered to say, I don't like this. He might not say it that nicely. I don't like this and I'm not going to do it.
right,
Doesn't understand that there are whole segments of our population that don't feel like they
right,
can say, I don't like this and I don't want to do it. And then you
right,
you couple that with being in the military as a woman who may have been raised to keep her mouth shut, and now she's in the military,
right,
she doesn't feel that way. So, like, I totally get why that wouldn't have been on your radar until
right,
somebody brought it to your attention. But that's another part of the work that we want to do as missions, is
right.
increase awareness that this is happening and it is affecting people. And it's okay that you didn't know, but now you do. And
Yeah,
let's do
yeah,
something.
absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. Go
Okay,
ahead, Ms.
so
Monte.
you're good. That was really good. So you're obviously a retired military officer. Could you give us just a little bit of your military
Oh, sure.
background?
Yep. So, um, I'm older than you, Monte. I enlisted in the Army in 1996. Fresh-faced, naive young woman, came into the military wanting to do good things and get a college education and be a part of something bigger than myself. And about 3 years into it, became aware of Army ROTC and that there were scholarships that were available if I wanted to go back to college full time, and then I could come back in the military as an officer, which is what I chose to do. So did that, commissioned as an officer, which is different than being enlisted. Commissioned as an officer in 2003. I was in the human resource field of the military. And so I handled a lot of personnel issues, and kind of by virtue of my position, often got to talk to the commanders directly about people things, right? So, and people would bring things to me, problems they were having with their pay, or they were getting ready to move to a new duty station and wanted to make sure their families were settled. And so I would collect up with that information and process it, or if there were issues, I would bring it to the commander's attention so they could weigh in on it and make it easier. And ended up, in lots of different assignments in lots of different places at all kinds of levels, from 50 people to 10,000 people. And then in my last military assignment, I got to be a professor of military science. So I was in charge of a university's Army ROTC program. And that was very rewarding because I was getting to help shape the future generation of military leaders, officers that were coming. They were doing what I did when I went through ROTC, finishing college, commissioning, and then going off to lead the military. So that's a little bit about my military background, but my whole life was changed in so many great ways by the military. And before I share some of the harder things, I want to be very clear. So much of what's good about my life. I met my husband. We have 3 beautiful children. I got 2 college degrees. I have friends scattered all over the world that I've met because of the military. And that's another part of the reason why I, want to be a part of this is, there are a lot of hard things about it, but there's a lot of good things. And I want to help people that have served and were affected get to a better place in their own lives if their moral injury is holding them back in any way.
Okay, so there are a ton of definitions for moral injury. We didn't really even define moral injury. How would you two define moral injury?
Dan,
Dan,
I'll
do you
let you
want to
take
go
this
first?
one. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a number of definitions out there, and I think when you're operationalizing research, you have to be very specific about what a definition of a phenomenon is that you're studying, right? But when you're doing ministry, when you're helping people, I think to me it helps to have a broader definition of moral injury so that people can define it for themselves or can identify it for themselves, because it's only the person can decide if they're morally injured. But the definition I keep in mind is, and this is related to what Dr. Nash described as moral injury a couple of conferences ago, but he said, it involves trauma, it involves a violation of deeply held moral beliefs, and then there's difficulty in coping afterwards. So that's the 3 sort of elements I keep in mind, is that the person went through some kind of trauma. They either were the survivor of a trauma or they perpetrated a trauma. That can happen too. It's a violation of deeply held moral beliefs. So it's beyond just an ethical violation. Maybe it's beyond, because we see ethical violations in our work, frequently in anybody's job. There's always somebody cheating a little bit on a report or lying a little to the boss or whatever. And we might identify, well, that's wrong, they shouldn't do that. But it may not be traumatic, or it may not cause you to have difficulty coping, or you may not be able to, whatever. So there are moral conflicts that are not moral injury, but there's a violation of deeply held moral beliefs of, in other words, they're deep in the sense that they guide your life, right? They are on a level of, even if you're not religious, right? They're on a biblical kind of level. In other words, that sort of like really important beliefs. And then the other piece is afterwards difficulty coping, forgiving, seeing the world in the same way. So it's something that completely changes your worldview, or shatters your current worldview and forces you to completely rethink some very important things that you held dear before, if that makes sense. So that's what I keep in mind when we're talking about moral injury.
Jamie,
Yeah.
would you want to?
So, you know, being a part of this organization, I take the same stance as Dan as far as an organization. We want to keep a very broad perspective. And I would just add that moral injury, there are as many definitions as there are people that believe they've experienced it,
Right.
because there could be things that I hold as sacred as an individual that nobody else holds as sacred. But once that's
Right.
violated, it has a deep wounding effect on me. And just to be really transparent and vulnerable, which I'm used to being at this point, but you know, I look back now on the young person that I was when I came in the military. I was so idealistic and in many ways so naive. And I believed every single thing I was told as it pertained to, this is what the military is about, and this is what it means to be a military leader. And we only do the right thing all the time. And I was like, yeah, that's what I want to be. I was just like, um, and it's adorable now, like that's so great that I felt that way. But the reality is, and now I'm much more on the realistic side of things, but maintaining some of that idealism, is that humans are humans. And for example, as good of a mom as I set out to be in the beginning, I screwed up, and as good of a wife as I started out to be the day I got married, like, I'm going to be the best wife in the whole wide world, right? Get tired, you get hungry, you say things you don't mean, and then you're like, screw that up, right? We all have shortcomings as human beings, and that applies to the human beings that run the military or any other
Right.
organization. We're all going to screw up. But so looking at that now on this side of my life and all the experience I've had, I would say to that young lady, hold on a second, don't forget these people are people, and people may not want to let you down, but they're going to let you down. But having these like pie in the sky ideas of what it means to be a military leader, yes, that's good, but it's still human beings, and human
Right.
beings make mistakes.
Right.
And so I say all that to say, that version of me was morally injured, and I stuffed it down in me and carried it through my life, not really taking the time to process it until way later. And other things happened along the way. But again, it just goes back to my point, like, everybody's different and everybody has their
Right.
own standards of what right looks like. And anytime that standard is violated, whether the rest of the world thinks they're being silly or not, doesn't matter. It's how it
Right.
impacts them in their heart. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So let me see. There are a ton of events that could happen in the military. What are some common ones, just so the public sort of understands moral injury in that service military point of view?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there's a lot of different things that can happen. A couple of examples, our organization focuses on service women, and so it's sort of common knowledge that women experience sexual trauma in the military. Now, that's not to say they all do. Who knows what the actual numbers are? I think they're vastly underreported, and so on. But many people that are familiar with moral injury, familiar with it as a term, and are women veteran or familiar with them, can sometimes assume that military sexual trauma um, is synonymous with moral injury. Like when you're talking moral injury in women, I can't tell you how many people. A lot of times it's men who say this, but not always. I can't tell you how many people have said, when I've talked about moral injury in service women, they go, "Oh, MST, military sexual trauma." And it's like, no, they're not the same. MST can certainly lead to moral injury. It is a potentially moral injurious experience, but it doesn't necessarily. Some women that have experienced sexual trauma in the military were not morally injured from the trauma, but um, from the lack of support they got afterwards, or other kind of things. But military sexual trauma, sexual assault, rape, harassment are common experiences of women who have service women who have moral injury. Um, the second example I would give is in combat, and this is where a lot of people think about moral injury directly related to combat, and it can be. But a friend of mine was an airborne ranger, and so during Iraq and Afghanistan, both those conflicts, he and his teammates killed a lot of people. That was their job, and it wasn't. What bothered him is not that they killed people. I mean that's not fun or good, but what really caused his moral injury is that a lot of times the people they killed were innocents, civilians and stuff, and because um, they would get intelligence. They would be told by their commander or whoever that, hey, look, the building that they were clearing, that they were going into, is what's called a free fire zone. In other words, everybody in that building's an enemy. Everybody's a bad guy. You could just, and so they would go into rooms throwing grenades, satchel charges, spraying everything, just very violent, which is standard procedure if you're clearing a building where there's nothing but enemy soldiers in it. But what they would find out later is that oftentimes there were also women and children in those buildings. And so at the time, he had never heard the term moral injury, but he and his friends, many of their teammates, were really struggling with drugs and alcohol, and they were just they didn't know why. Of course, he was diagnosed with PTSD, but it wasn't until a chaplain introduced him to the term moral injury and explained it to him that he realized, that's what I have. Because it wasn't the combat, it wasn't the violence of combat, it wasn't the fear of combat, which is all of that, but it was that guilt inside of him, that he and his buddies pushed down using drugs and alcohol, knowing that he took the life of people that weren't soldiers, they weren't combatants, and they were told to do it. And so the guilt and shame that he experienced, was moral injury. And he was on PTSD medicine. But it didn't help him at all until he learned about moral injury, and then it helped him greatly to understand moral injury. And of course, that chaplain helped him through, work through the guilt and shame, and so on. But those are two examples, military examples, that sort of relate to common type things that might happen either in combat, or just being a woman in the military can sometimes be very dangerous, because of some of the issues that continue to exist in the military, for some people.
And Jamie, I know we've talked about like dived in a little bit into your like moral injury. Do you want to go ahead and just share with us just a little bit, whatever you're comfortable with?
Yeah. And part of why I do this work is because it does have a little bit of a therapeutic effect to be able to talk about it and to
Mhm.
share it in a way that can help other people. So I'm actually pretty comfortable sharing at this point, thanks to Dan's work. Um, so I think, kind of going back to the young ideal version of me, I feel like in some cases I set myself up for moral injury just out of that naivete, if you will. Um, but later, when I had a clearer understanding, like we're all human, there were still some times where I knew something was wrong and I might have gone to a superior to express my what I had noticed and what I thought about it from my perspective, and got my perspective validated. Yes, that's wrong. And then when I asked, so what are we going to do about it? And the response from the superior officer was, well, I don't know what you're going to do about it, but I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole, kind of a thing. And so standing there feeling stunned that the leader acknowledged that what I was concerned about was valid and yet wouldn't support me in doing the right thing by addressing it out of fear of, maybe they thought they would lose their career or it would negatively impact their reputation or negatively impact their family. At the end of the day, again, people are human and they're going to do what they think is in the best interest of the things that they care about the most. And when it came to the military and this issue and their own livelihood and their family, they were frankly choosing their family. Sometimes it's ego, sometimes it's something, less, understandable. Um, and then I would have to decide, with or without their support, am I going to do something or not? And there was a couple of occasions where I didn't do anything. I'm like, well, if they must know something I don't know and they're not doing anything about it. So maybe I shouldn't do anything about it either. But then noticing for days afterwards, I felt bad. I felt bad about myself. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I would wonder, what are the implications if this person does this again, and kind of having to live with that, and then how that affecting my view of myself as a leader. Like, again, going back to the idealistic leader, they always do the right thing and they don't care what anyone thinks, and they're going to fall on their sword if they think it's the right thing, and then taking a step back and going, well, I didn't do that, so what does that make me? But
Yeah.
again, realizing like we're all human and we don't always know what to do. And if you don't feel like you can talk about it with people that you trust, that, then you just feel stuck and kind of scared and isolated. So that was a type of experience I had. And then, going back to what Dan said, I definitely don't want to paint the picture of the military as just daily sexual harassment, daily
Right.
sexual assault, although it does happen. And it happened to me on a number of occasions. And when I was young and didn't, you know, feel like I had a voice, I would kind of put up with it, or I'd be like, oh, they're just stupid, I'm going to blow it off. And then later in my career, when I did feel an obligation as a leader to say something because what that person was doing could potentially affect other people, it wasn't even about me anymore. It was about stopping somebody who could ruin it for other people. Um, I brought it to the attention of, some a superior officer. I'm not saying a leader on purpose because leaders wouldn't do this, but they outranked me. I'll just say that. Yeah. And they just kind of blew it off, and they're like, "Oh, that guy's a knucklehead. Don't worry about it." But I was saying, as a leader, I'm coming to you because I want something to be done, and I felt like I got dismissed. Um, and again, I could have gone to the next level up. I could have jumped up and down on his desk. I could have done other things to do, make a point. But I had a job to do and I had soldiers to take care of. And I'm like, part of me was like, whatever, I'm just going to go back to doing what I was doing. Well, then fast forward, I retired from the military, and there was a lot going on in the news about soldiers being affected by sexual assault and sexual harassment and things like that. And now I had the time to think about the totality of my experience and all the times that things had happened to me that either I didn't say anything or I did say something and nobody did anything. And I started to really feel the guilt and shame of that for the first time. Like, how did I, as an individual, contribute to a culture that, can dismiss women and dismiss their families when their families are expressing concern, and try to keep it under wraps, so to speak, while they figure it out. And that's when I really was like, and I talked to Dan about this earlier today, like, you can't go back. You can't change what you did or didn't do. The only thing you can do is kind of forgive yourself and then say, what can I do with what I know now to make a difference in people's lives? So, the stories, like the details of the stories, are not as important as the overall idea and the feeling, but then also the hope that organizations like MISNS give to people to say, okay, I can't change what happened. I want to feel better about this. And how can I do that and then help other people get on the other side of their moral injury?
Right. And were you seeing someone like to help with like your moral injury?
Counseling. Yeah, I'm big fan of therapists. I think everybody should have a therapist. It's like preventative maintenance. Yeah, really when I started getting clear on some of this stuff was towards the last couple years of my military career. I was seeing a counselor. We weren't really talking about moral injury necessarily, but I was telling her about a sexual harassment situation that I experienced. And, she was validating, like, that shouldn't happen to you. And I'm like, I know. But then very recently, I'll share that I finally, this is 4 years after I retired, I finally went through the VA, the Veterans Administration, mental health disability process, and had to talk about this again, and discovered that it was quite triggering to have to tell the stories all over again to somebody new, right? But through that process, got tied back into some pretty great mental health professionals, and I have great friends that I can talk about this with too. And so I think it takes a lot of the sting and the power out of it when you find those safe spaces to talk about it. So I highly encourage, like, we just get in our heads and we just make it worse and amplify it so much more. But when we talk about it, it gets the energy out of our bodies and puts it where we can process it. So I do believe in counseling, and yes, I see a counselor to this day.
And are there any events outside of the military as well that can cause, like, obviously there is, but like what are some like normal events as well so that people can understand what they're going through as well, because they might not know about the term moral injury as well, but we're here obviously to help with that.
Yeah, so couple examples from the medical fields, especially with COVID, a lot of medical professionals have talked about the lack of personal protective equipment that there was available. They had to see COVID patients without proper PPE. during that time. And that was moral injurious to some. There were others. Doctors talk about, knowing care that a patient should have that they really need, but having that care denied by insurance companies, or in some cases, like for instance, in Canada, where it's a one payer system, the government system, the government denying, whoever is responsible denying care because it costs too much. And so doctors, nurses, etc., who take that oath, and they're in the healthcare field to help people, and yet are being denied that ability. And so they have to watch patients suffer or even die because there's a lack of resources, or unwillingness by insurance companies or whoever to pay for that. A Another example of something that could happen to anybody. You think about a drunk driver accident that causes death. Often the drunk driver walks away with some bruises while the people they hit, die. That could be moral injurious because you have the elements, right? You have trauma, you have vehicle trauma, and injury. You have difficulty coping afterwards if you lost your spouse or child or whatever to the accident. And then you have the violation of a deeply held moral belief. It's not, if it was an accident, just a freak accident might be different, but you have somebody who made the choice to drink too much alcohol, made the choice to get in the car and drive it, made the choice to be out of control, in the sense the previous choices led to them being out of control, and then causing an accident that killed somebody. And then often, you get a lawyer, you're willing to pay enough money. How much, I had friends in the military who had multiple DUIs. And so, where's their accountability? I have a friend who works in the family loss. She's a therapist for, many of them are women who are spouses who are suffered a domestic, like they had a domestic violence situation or whatever. And so there's a divorce, but now, they have to share their children with that abusive spouse, because most states don't do a very good job of protecting children and spouses in those situations. So those are all examples outside the military that can result in moral injury for people.
Like that drunk driving one was definitely a common one, pretty easy for people to understand.
Absolutely.
So how does moral injury affect a person's ability to reintegrate into society after military service? Because I know they're seeing chaplains there too. Like, who can they see when they leave the military?
So you asked how it affects. Well, when it's very common in society today, and I think it's more good than bad, that people get thanked for their service. Military service members get treated like heroes and stuff. And personally, as a service member myself, I'm always very uncomfortable with that. But if you're a person who deployed overseas and did some things that you're ashamed of, like my friend, the airborne ranger, who was directly responsible for the death of innocent women and children. And even if he wasn't to blame, in the sense he was following orders, and those orders were wrong, even though he didn't know they were, or the intelligence was bad, whatever the case, he still is carrying that guilt and shame. And when people thank him for his service, and other service members have expressed this, it can re-trigger the guilt and shame, because they don't feel like what they did was okay, right? So when veterans return from deployments, even if they are not morally injured, they often feel that civilians just don't understand, because there really aren't civilian equivalents to what they go through over there. And so there's already a feeling of like they don't understand. But now if you take moral injury, then not only do they fear that that they don't understand, right? Civilians don't understand, they fear being judged very harshly. Or if a civilian understood or knew what I did, they'd be horrified. And so there's this difficulty on, I'll let Jamie talk about reintegration with family, but in terms of veterans reintegrating in society, it's like entering a world that, you know, you're an alien to, just on the basis of your experience that other people can't possibly fully know what you've been through.
So I deployed to Afghanistan for a year, 2009 to 2010. And I had three, well, no, I had a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. No, sorry. I'm getting these times that my husband and my husband and I, here's an example. We spent almost a total of 7 years geographically separated. Like he was in one part of the country and I was in the one part of the country, or he was deployed for 15 months to Iraq while I was home raising the kids, and then we would switch. And so I'm getting a lot of this confused in my mind. But when my oldest daughter was a first grader and my second daughter was 4 years old and a preschooler, I deployed. Missed my oldest daughter's entire first grade year, like never met her teacher, never stepped foot in her school. Just that whole year is gone, right? As far as being her mom. And then I was deployed, and we worked hard. We were there, 24/7, 7 days a week, working every day. I would get up at 6 and I'd often not get 6 in the morning, and I would often not get home till 1 or 2 in the morning. So I worked a lot, and I poured my heart and soul and mind and everything into the mission. And then I came home, and every soldier that comes home is supposed to have a mental health screening with a psychologist to determine, are you okay? Do you need special help? And because I hadn't been in like direct combat, I had actually, there was a bomb that went off across the street from where I was, and I felt the pressure of but I never got shot at and I didn't have to shoot anyone. So you would think, well, that's not that bad, right? But anyways, I'm in the mental health consultation after my deployment, and the doctor, who was a civilian who had not served in the military, said to me, don't it's a complete waste of time what we're doing over there, isn't it? And as a mom who had just left my kids for a year, I needed to believe that what we were doing was important, and that I was an important member of the team, and that my contributions and my sacrifices meant something. Like I needed to believe that. And then to have this civilian who's been, eating at McDonald's and living his best life while I was over there doing that, is looking at me saying, isn't that a complete waste of time? And I'm a very nice person. I've never gotten in a fight in my life, physically, but I almost came over the desk and just like, punched his in the face. And I was like, holy smokes. Like, and I feel that way. I can't imagine what some of my brothers and sisters feel that have had much more traumatic things going on, and to have somebody who just doesn't have a clue say something like that. Those are the kinds of things that also make you feel like, you're an alien on a different planet. Like, who are these people? They don't get anything, and that was hard. The only other funny thing I'll say about this isn't moral injury, but it was frustrating, is when I was deployed, 3 meals a day were cooked for me in the dining facility, so I could just go get food and eat it, and it was ready, and all the fruit was chopped up and the food was cooked, and I only had to do laundry for myself, and I would pick up my room and I would leave and come back and everything was where I left it, and then had to come home to my family who had somehow magically survived without me for a whole year, and all of a sudden they don't know what to eat and they don't know where their jeans are, and I come home from work and socks and shoes are everywhere. That was frustrating, but
She's back now.
I wouldn't classify it as moral injury, but it was hard to reintegrate into that. So
Yeah.
anyways.
I just want to know, what are some long-term goals with missions? Dan?
Yeah, so we as I mentioned earlier, we have our research projects that we're doing, and those in themselves are going to be long-term projects. Like the current one, we did a research project where we looked at moral injury in women veterans. That is still ongoing. We're not actively recruiting. We've interviewed or surveyed about 50 women. But we continue to analyze and mine that data for useful information and things that we're presenting and printing and getting published to educate and train providers on those issues. That will continue. The current research project we're doing is looking at the moral injurious experiences of military spouses of service members with PTSD. So that we're actively recruiting for that project. But again, that's going to be long term because we're exploring that phenomenon. There's very little research out there about that. But part of the research is identifying gaps in support for spouses. And so that may lead to us creating new initiatives, newer projects to help provide that direct support. So long term, we're going to continue to do research that covers gaps in support for both servicewomen and military spouses. Our training and education system programs will continue to grow and expand. This year we add retreat leader training for those groups running retreats. Many of them are not, looking at moral injury in folks, or not. Their retreats are organized around PTSD, those kind of issues, but we think effective retreats will be able to identify moral injury in people and be able to do things to help folks. Those programs will continue to expand, and then our direct support will look to be able to provide support to more and more women each year. So our long-term goal is to help as many service women and families as we can that are suffering from moral injury, and to train thousands of chaplain psychologists and social workers, retreat leaders, other providers on moral injury, how it affects people, and how to do effective support. There are a lot of organizations, a lot of ways that people can get help and that do help. So part of it is not just creating all the initiatives for ourselves, but for those programs that are empirically based, that are working, we highlight those kind of things in our conferences so that providers can make access them, but also we train and educate people, and there will be some new initiatives coming up. So we are determined to be a highly effective, influential in the sense of helping the VA, other government agencies, nonprofit groups, partnering with them to help them be as effective as they can be, and thereby transforming the lives of millions of veterans and military family members through both our work and our partnership with others, and enabling other other ministries, other organizations to do effective work. Yeah. So
Yeah. I like to call it dot connecting. We're just trying to create space to bring in all the dots so we can get the dots connected with each other and we can help the most people as possible. Because, you know, trying to do anything all by yourself is, you know, you're only going to get this far. There's a great quote. You can get there fast on your own and you can get farther together. And we're trying to get farther together. So,
yeah, absolutely.
So I think this should be a good stopping point, but we are, like we said, we're gonna, throughout the series, we'll be hearing from individuals who've experienced moral injury firsthand. But it's going to be World Mental Health Day. We're going to be releasing something for that specific day where we'll be bringing Dr. Amanda Yeck. Dan, do you want to go ahead and just introduce her just a little?
Yeah. Dr. Amanda Yeck is a brilliant psychologist in the Asheville, North Carolina VA, and she, with a couple of co-workers of her, other professionals, chaplain and social worker, have created a great program to provide support to morally injured veterans. It's a multi-week program. It's been very effective, and they are helping a lot of veterans through their morally injured veterans through their work. And so it'll be great to have her on to explain kind of some of the things she's been doing and how she got into that moral injury work, and you know what are the latest updates with her. I do want to say that anybody who's listening to this podcast or watching this video, if you have a need, if you need some emotional or spiritual support, you'd like to reach out and get some help or find out about some resources, you can reach us through the Harriet Tubman Network, which is our network of women chaplains and counselors who are you know, understand moral injury. They can help other service women by providing that pastoral care. You can reach a chaplain in the Harriet Tubman Network by calling 910-701-0306 or going to our website, missions.org, MISNS.org. There's a Harriet Tubman page there that you can request support, or you can email droberts@chaplainconsultants.com and request support. You can also reach out to us if you're just interested in volunteering to help missions. If this is something that you care deeply about, like Jamie, she called me out of the blue and to wanting to help because of her own experiences. There may be others like that. You can again call 910-701-0306 or go to our website missions.org or email me. We're Of course, we're a nonprofit organization, so we really run on donations. So you can donate. Every little bit counts. Every little bit helps. Every dollar is useful, and we appreciate it. Missions.org/donate is our donation page. And you can donate one time, or you can set up a monthly donation to go to us, and we promise we'll use it to help other people. So yeah.
And Dan, would you like to just speak briefly on our conference in September of 2024? We want to share about that for any practitioners who might be listening and wanting to learn more about how they can get pulled into the network of support.
Sure. So the Comprehensive Moral Injury Conference occurs every year. We bring presenters and providers from all over the world. They come together to talk about moral injury research. They present information on their latest research, recovery methods they're doing with folks. We have some great discussions around the issue of moral injury, not just for service women, but also, it's a broad scoped conference. So we've had presenters talk about moral injury in the healthcare field, in the law field. Lawyers have souls too. So they can be morally injured also. We've had presenters and attendees from the US, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So it really is a international conference. And psychologists and social workers and chaplains receive continuing education credit, 12 to 15 credit hours for attending. The next one is September 10th through 12th in Atlanta, Georgia. And you can sign up for the conference newsletter if you go to our website and just click on the programs tab. There's under that menu, you can click on the conference, and there's you can put your email address and send that to us, and we'll keep you updated on the conference as we plan it, put it together. Next year, 2024, the first day of that conference, chaplains will be able to get certified in the Building Spiritual Strength program if they'd like. The next day is all about military moral injury and service women. The day after that is family dynamics of moral injury. So we're going to talk about moral injury as it relates to military spouses and children, etc. And then that last day is sort of a specialty track where we'll do breakouts, chaplain, psychologist, social worker breakouts, or we'll have a variety of presentations on various issues. So that third day, a lot of different things happening on that day. But again, you can find out all that information on our website and, sign up to get the newsletter. So that covers it pretty well, Jamie, or do I need to?
I think that's great. And yeah, this is a very powerful conference that's coming up, and we're getting really excited. We're already planning it. We're already talking to a lot of the speakers. We've got some really dynamic keynote speakers lined up already, ready to go. So I can't wait to be a part of it. So, but that's all I think we've got for you tonight, Mantay. Do you have any other questions or thoughts for us?
No, that's it. I think that was a good dive into moral injury, and we hope to see you guys in the next episode.
Wonderful. Thanks.